I was arranging cards at table 7 when she walked in. The woman who would unmake my life. The Royal Flush Casino pulsed with its usual Friday night fever, the hypnotic clinking of chips, the collective held breath before a wheel stopped spinning, the faint cologne of desperation mixed with top-shelf whiskey. But when Kimberly Allen entered, the ambient soundtrack of my world seemed to dim. "The Sphinx is here," whispered Marco, my pit boss, with something like reverence. "Keep your eyes sharp, Alexandra." I'd heard the stories. Professional poker player who'd cleared out casinos from Vegas to Monaco. Never a smile, never a tell. They called her the Sphinx, not just for her inscrutability, but for her ability to riddle out opponents' hands with almost supernatural precision. She chose my table. Of course she did. 5,000, she said, sliding her chips forward with slender fingers that bore a single silver ring. Constellation-shaped, I noticed, Ursa Major visible among the tiny diamonds. I gave her my dealer smile, careful, measured, nothing like the wildfire panic spreading through my chest. "Welcome to the Royal Flush, ma'am." The autumn rain tapped against the high windows like impatient fingers, creating a rhythm that matched my quickening pulse. Under the amber pendant lights, her blonde hair took on a honeyed glow, and those green eyes, Jesus, those eyes cut right through my professional veneer. For 3 hours I dealt her cards with trembling fingertips that I prayed she wouldn't notice. 3 hours of studying her face, searching for what everyone said wasn't there. Emotion tells, humanity behind the calculating gaze. 3 hours of catching the faint scent of something unexpected, not designer perfume, but something earthy and scientific, like the observatory where I spent my off hours. "You're counting my breaths between shuffles," she said quietly during a lull, not looking up from her cards. The deck nearly slipped from my hands. "Excuse me?" "My breathing pattern. You're tracking it, looking for my tell." Her voice had a smoky quality that seemed designed to bypass my ears and travel directly to some primal part of my brain. Smart. Most dealers watch hands or eyes. I should have denied it. Should have maintained professional distance. Instead, did I find it? The corner of her mouth lifted, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. Not even close. When my shift ended at 2 a.m., I found her waiting by the employee exit, leaning against the wall with casual confidence that made my stomach tighten. "I counted your cards," I said before she could speak. "You were counting cards at my table." She didn't deny it. Just tilted her head, studying me like I was a particularly interesting constellation. "And yet you said nothing. Maybe I wanted to see how far you'd go." "Alexandra Jackson," she said my name like she was tasting it. "Astronomy enthusiast, mathematical prodigy who Delius cards instead of pursuing academia, and the only person to notice my counting pattern in 5 years." The hallway suddenly felt too narrow, the air too thin. "How do you know about the astronomy?" She stepped closer. I caught that scent again, telescope metal and midnight air. "Your eyes, when you look up at the skylight every 47 minutes, checking the star's position." My back hit the wall as she moved closer still, her breath warm against my neck. Her hand reached up, not to touch me but to brace against the wall beside my head. The nearness of her was dizzying. "I have a proposition for you," she whispered. Before she could continue, Marco rounded the corner. "Jackson, you forgot to sign." He stopped, eyes darting between us. Kimberly stepped back smoothly. "Consider what I said," she murmured, then walked away, the click of her heels fading down the corridor. "What was that about?" Marco asked, suspicious. I touched my lips, still tingling from words that hadn't even kissed them. "I have no idea." What I didn't tell him was how her heartbeat had quickened against my wrist when she leaned in, the only tell from the Sphinx I'd ever need. What I couldn't possibly know then was that in exactly 17 days, I would lose everything I owned because of her, and somehow it would feel worth it. 2 days after my encounter with Kimberly Allen, I needed escape. The casino's recycled air and artificial light had become suffocating, especially with the memory of her perfume still haunting me. I needed stars, real ones, not the gaudy imitations hanging from the casino ceiling. Chicago's autumn night air bit at my cheeks as I hurried up the steps to the observatory dome of the Chicago Stargazers Society. This modest building, tucked away from downtown's light pollution, had been my sanctuary since I moved here 3 years ago. Amateur astronomers and cosmic enthusiasts gathered here weekly, bonding over celestial bodies rather than earthly matters. "Alexandra, just in time," called Professor Winters, the elderly physicist who ran the society. "Lambert's comet is making a rare appearance tonight. Once every 12 years, and with this meteor shower, it's truly special." I nodded, already feeling the tension in my shoulders releasing. Here, I wasn't a dealer reading people's desperation. Here, I read the universe instead. "New telescope in position 3, Winters added. "Top of the line, give it a try." I made my way through the small crowd, nodding to familiar faces, when I stopped cold. There, bent over telescope 3, was a profile I'd only seen under casino lights. Blonde hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, revealing the elegant curve of her neck. I nearly turned and left, but something, curiosity, magnetism, or sheer masochism, pulled me forward. "You're in my spot," I said, immediately regretting how childish it sounded. Kimberly Allen straightened, no surprise registering on her face. Those green eyes locked onto mine like she'd been expecting me all along. "Alexandra, I wondered if you'd come tonight." She stepped aside, gesturing to the telescope. "Professor Winters mentioned you're the resident expert on Lambert's comet." I hesitated before taking her place at the eyepiece. "How do you know Winters?" "I've been a member for years, Thursday nights when I'm in town." She stood close enough that I could smell that same scent, not perfume, but something like polished metal and night air. "Strange we've never crossed paths before. I'm usually here Tuesdays." I bent to the telescope, trying to focus on the comet streak rather than her presence beside me. "So you're... what? Following me now?" "Coincidence." She leaned against the dome wall. "Or cosmic alignment, if you prefer." I straightened to look at her, searching for signs of the poker face that made her famous. But here, away from the tables, she seemed different, still intense, still unreadable, but somehow more authentic. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked suddenly. "From the casino, 2 nights ago? Hard to forget." She shook her head. "University of Chicago, Advanced Theoretical Mathematics 2013, you guest lectured while still a graduate student. Your theory on pattern recognition in astronomical phenomena." The memory rushed back, a packed lecture hall, my first major presentation. That was 10 years ago. "You were there?" "Front row. Asked about applying your theory to human behavioral patterns." I said it was possible but ethically questionable, I recalled, stunned. "You've been tracking me since then?" "Not tracking, remembering." She moved to the telescope beside mine. "Your theory changed my career path." I watched her adjust the settings with practiced ease. "From astronomy to poker? Pattern recognition is pattern recognition. Stars, cards, people, all follow predictable sequences if you know what to look for." For the next hour, we existed in silence broken only by occasional comments about Lambert's comet. I found myself hyper-aware of her every movement, how she tucked hair behind her ear when concentrating, how her breath created small clouds in the chilly air. "There," she said suddenly, voice hushed with genuine wonder. "That's not on any star chart." I moved to her telescope and she stepped aside, our shoulders brushing. I bent to look through the eyepiece and caught my breath. A brilliant blue streak cut across the field of vision, something unexpected, uncharted. "May I?" she asked, her hand hovering near the focusing knob. I nodded, and as she leaned in to adjust it, her fingers brushed against mine. The contact was brief but electric. I pulled back slightly but didn't move away as she fine-tuned the focus. In the dim blue light of the observatory, with the silhouette of her profile against the domed ceiling, she looked nothing like the feared poker player, just a woman captivated by the same cosmic mysteries that had always drawn me. "Beautiful," she whispered, and I wasn't sure if she meant the comet or something else entirely. "Yes," I agreed, not looking through the lens anymore. As the night drew to a close and members began packing up, she handed me a card with a phone number. I meant what I said. "I have a proposition for you." "Professional or personal?" I asked before I could stop myself. For the first time, I saw genuine amusement cross her face. "Is there a difference?" She walked away, leaving me holding her card and staring after her like a cosmic body caught in unexpected orbit. Later, lying awake in bed, I realized she'd never actually denied counting cards at my table, she'd simply changed the game entirely. I stared at Kimberly's card for 3 days before calling her. 3 days of dealing cards at the Royal Flush, scanning the entrance each time the doors opened, disappointed when she didn't appear. "I was beginning to think you'd lost my number," she answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting with the phone in hand. "I've been busy." A lie. "What's this proposition?" "Not over the phone. My place tonight. 8 o'clock. She gave me an address in Streeterville, then added, "Bring your analytical mind, Alexandra." Her building overlooked Lake Michigan, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky. The doorman already knew my name. The elevator required a special key for her penthouse floor. Everything about it screamed success in a language I barely understood. When she opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the poker face, replaced by something more relaxed. She wore jeans and a simple black sweater, hair loose around her shoulders. More striking than the casual attire was the glass of whiskey in her hand, not her first, judging by the slight flush on her cheeks. "Welcome to my home," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The apartment was surprisingly warm, not the sterile showcase I'd expected. One wall was entirely bookshelves, another displayed vintage astronomical charts. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed Chicago's skyline like a living painting. "Nice place for a card shark," I said, accepting the whiskey she offered. "Professional poker player," she corrected. "There's a difference." She led me to a dining table where a deck of cards waited. "Sit, let me teach you something." "I deal cards for a living," I reminded her. "You distribute them, not the same as playing." She shuffled with graceful efficiency. "First lesson, poker isn't about the cards you're dealt. It's about how you play them." For the next 2 hours, she walked me through strategies I'd observed but never understood. Her focus was absolute, her explanations precise. Occasionally our fingers would brush as we moved cards, and each time I felt that same electric current from the observatory. "You're a natural," she said after I won my 3rd consecutive hand. "You understand patterns intuitively." Years of watching people lose their savings gives you perspective. She studied me over her glass. "You disapprove of gambling." "I disapprove of delusion. Most people at the casino aren't gambling, they're buying hope with terrible odds." "Yet you work there." "Limited options with my particular skill set." I rearranged my cards unnecessarily. Math prodigy who panicked during her doctoral defense doesn't exactly open corporate doors. Her expression shifted subtly, surprise, then recognition. "The University of Chicago incident. You walked out mid-presentation." The memory still stung. Public speaking panic attack, couldn't breathe, couldn't think, committee wasn't sympathetic. "So you hide at a blackjack table instead of revolutionizing astronomical pattern theory." Her assessment hit too close. "Why am I here, Kimberly? What's the proposition?" She leaned back, swirling amber liquid in her glass. "I need a partner for a major tournament. Someone who reads patterns like you do." "To cheat?" "To win." She looked offended. "I don't cheat, Alexandra. I calculate odds better than most." "Why me?" "There are professional players who think like professionals. I need someone who thinks differently." She refilled our glasses. "Third lesson tonight, knowing when to ask questions." "That's only the second lesson." Her smile was slight but genuine. "The first was seeing if you'd come at all." As the night progressed and the whiskey bottle emptied, our conversation drifted from cards to constellations. She showed me her collection of rare astronomy books, fingers tracing illustrations with unexpected tenderness. "My father was an astronomer," she revealed, voice softer than I'd heard before. "Amateur but passionate. He died when I was 12. The personal disclosure caught me off guard. "I'm sorry. Cancer. Slow and cruel." She closed the book carefully. "He taught me to see patterns everywhere. His last gift to me. And you used it for poker." "I used it to survive." Something vulnerable flashed across her face. "My mother, after he died, gambling addiction, the irony isn't lost on me." The confession hung between us, heavy with implications I couldn't yet decipher. "So that's why you're so controlled? The Sphinx persona?" I asked. She moved closer, our shoulders touching as we stood before her bookshelf. "What happens when the Sphinx cracks, Alexandra?" Are you curious? My heart hammered against my ribs. Maybe. I've watched you for years, she admitted quietly. Not just at the casino. Your guest lectures, your papers before you disappeared from academia. Your mind fascinates me. Just my mind? The whiskey made me bold. Her fingers brushed my cheek, so lightly I might have imagined it. No, not just your mind. I'm not sure who moved first. Maybe we both did, drawn by the same gravitational pull that keeps planets in orbit. Her lips tasted like whiskey and secrets finally told. Her hands tangled in my hair as mine found her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened with an intensity that made my knees weak. When we finally separated, both breathless, she rested her forehead against mine. That wasn't part of the proposition, she whispered. Consider it my counter-offer, I replied. She laughed then, not the Sphinx's calculated amusement, but something real and unguarded. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, and I knew right then I was in serious trouble. Because somewhere between the poker lessons and the kiss, I'd started falling for the one woman who made unpredictability an art form. I woke to the distant sound of my phone buzzing somewhere in Kimberly's apartment. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows I'd forgotten to close the blinds on last night. For a moment, I just lay there, taking in the unfamiliar luxury of Egyptian cotton sheets and the faint scent of Kimberly's shampoo on the pillow beside me. She wasn't in bed, but I could hear her voice from another room. Tense, professional, completely different from the woman who had whispered against my skin hours earlier. I fumbled for my phone, finding it on the nightstand beneath my watch. 17 missed calls, 23 text messages, all variations of the same news. The market had crashed overnight. Not a correction, not a dip, a full-blown collapse that financial networks were already calling Black Monday the sequel. My stomach turned to ice as I opened my investment app with trembling fingers. My retirement account, $237.18 remaining from nearly $90,000. My emergency savings, $412.56 from $35,000. My mutual funds, complete devastation. No, I whispered, refreshing the screen again and again as if the numbers might magically revert. No, no, no. Years of careful saving from my casino salary gone. The modest inheritance from my grandmother that I'd invested instead of spending vanished. The financial security I'd built despite my academic failure erased overnight. Alexandra? Kimberly stood in the doorway, phone in hand, expression grave. She was already dressed in a charcoal suit, hair pulled back severely, the Sphinx fully assembled. You've seen the news? I couldn't speak, just turned my phone toward her, showing the devastating numbers. She sat beside me on the bed, not touching, respecting the bubble of panic forming around me. How bad? Everything, I managed. I lost everything. Not everything, she said, her voice steady. You still have your job, your apartment. I was 3 months from paying off my student loans, I cut her off. I've been living below my means for years, saving so I could eventually go back, finish my doctorate. Now. I gestured helplessly at my phone. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What will you do?" The question jolted me from shock to survival mode. I pulled the sheet around me, suddenly conscious of my nakedness in more ways than one. Work, extra shifts at the casino. Maybe Vegas pays dealers better. Or, she said carefully, you could consider my tournament proposition more seriously. I laughed bitterly. You want me to gamble after I just lost my life savings? I want you to partner with me using your exceptional mathematical mind. Her tone remained even, controlled. The Chicago Championship has a $2 million prize pool. And what would my cut be? I hated how mercenary I sounded, but panic was driving me now. 50-50. I stared at her. Why would you offer that? You don't need me. I believe otherwise. She stood, adjusting her cuffs with precise movements. Get dressed. We'll talk more over breakfast. I showered in her bathroom that was bigger than my entire kitchen, trying to think clearly under the rainfall showerhead. By the time I emerged, wearing borrowed clothes that fit suspiciously well, I'd made a decision I hoped I wouldn't regret. Kimberly sat at her dining table, papers spread before her, laptop open. She'd prepared coffee and a simple breakfast that I couldn't bring myself to touch. There's another option, I said, not sitting down. I know people. Underground games in Chinatown. High stakes, loose security. Her expression darkened. Absolutely not. I could win enough to. You could get robbed, arrested, or worse. She closed her laptop with finality. Those games aren't regulated for a reason. I need money now, not after some tournament that might not. I said no. Her fist hit the table with enough force to rattle the coffee cups, the first genuine display of emotion I'd seen from her outside the bedroom. That's not an option, Alexandra. The sudden intensity silenced me. She took a deep breath, visibly composing herself. Those games destroyed my mother, she said more quietly. She lost everything, our house, her dignity, eventually her life. I sank into the chair across from her. I didn't know. When I said gambling addiction, I meant it. She pushed a folder toward me. This is the tournament information. Buy-in is $25,000, which I'll cover. You train with me for the next 3 weeks. Follow my lead. Learn what I teach you. And if we lose? We won't. Her certainty was almost convincing. But if we do, you owe me nothing. I leafed through the tournament details, buying time as my mind calculated odds and possibilities. Why me? Really? Because I've watched you work. You see things others miss. She hesitated, then added more softly. And because I think we'd make an excellent team. Something in her tone made me look up. Beyond the Sphinx's professional mask, I glimpsed vulnerability that matched my own. This wasn't just about the tournament for her, just as it wasn't just about money for me. Partners, then, I agreed, extending my hand. Instead of shaking it, she came around the table and tilted my chin up, kissing me with surprising gentleness. Partners, she confirmed against my lips. What followed was not gentle at all. She pulled me from the chair with unexpected strength, pressing me against the cool glass of the window overlooking Chicago. The city that had just taken everything from me spread out below, as her hands reclaimed territory explored hours earlier. The neighbors? I gasped as her fingers traced patterns lower. Tinted glass, she murmured, dropping to her knees. Another investment that's paying off. Afterward, as I struggled to steady my breathing, she looked up at me with something dangerous in her eyes. The tournament starts in 3 weeks. Your training begins now. I had no idea then that the skills she would teach me weren't just for playing cards, but for recognizing an elaborate conspiracy that was already closing around us, both like a perfectly dealt hand. Kimberly's idea of training wasn't what I expected. I thought we'd be playing cards for hours, and we did, but it was so much more brutal than that. Again, she said, for what felt like the 100th time that day. We'd been at it for 6 hours straight, no breaks except for water. What's the statistical probability of improving a flush draw on the turn? 19.1%, I answered, fighting to keep my voice steady despite exhaustion. And with 2 cards to come? 35%. Your tell is in your left eyebrow, she said coldly. It twitches when you're calculating. Fix it. I rubbed my face in frustration. Nobody watches eyebrows that closely. I do. She reshuffled the deck with machine-like precision. And so will Chen Wu if you make it to the final table. The man hasn't blinked since 1997, but he'll catch your twitch. This was day 5 of what Kimberly called immersion training. I'd taken a 3-week leave from the casino, unpaid, of course, further depleting my dwindling resources. Every day from 8 a.m. to midnight, she drilled me on probabilities, player profiles, and psychological warfare. When we weren't playing cards, we were watching videos of previous tournaments, analyzing betting patterns of potential opponents. You're pushing too hard, I said, standing to stretch my cramping legs. The competition will push harder. She didn't even look up from her cards. Sit down, we're not finished. I am. I walked to the kitchen for water, my throat parched from hours of concentration. I'm not a machine, Kimberly. I need actual rest. The tournament doesn't care what you need. Her voice followed me, sharp and uncompromising. $1 million doesn't care what you need. My share, you mean? I turned to face her. Or are you reconsidering our arrangement? Something dangerous flashed in her eyes. Don't question my integrity, then don't question my commitment. I slammed the water glass down. I lost everything, remember? I have more at stake than you. Do you? She stood slowly, setting the cards aside with deliberate care. You lost money. I have reputation on the line. Credibility. My entire identity is built on winning. Maybe that's the problem. The words escaped before I could stop them. You've forgotten there's a person behind the Sphinx. She moved toward me with predatory grace, backing me against the counter. And you think you know that person after a week in my bed? The coldness in her voice stung worse than any insult. We'd barely touched since training began, the passionate woman from that first night replaced by this relentless taskmaster. I'm beginning to wonder if anyone knows her, I replied quietly. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face, so quickly I almost missed it. Then her expression hardened again. Take 15 minutes. Then we continue. The chime of the elevator interrupted our standoff. Kimberly tensed, immediately alert. Are you expecting someone? I asked. No. She moved to the security panel, checking the camera. It's Thomas Long. My stomach dropped. Thomas was the casino manager, my boss, and definitely not someone who should be showing up at Kimberly's penthouse. What does he want? I whispered. Let's find out. She pressed the intercom. Yes? Ms. Allen, Thomas's voice crackled through the speaker. Forgive the intrusion. I have a business matter to discuss. Kimberly glanced at me, then pressed the button allowing him access. Clear the table, she instructed. And remember, you're here as my student, nothing more. Thomas Long entered like he owned the place. Expensive suit. Cologne that announced his presence before he did. A smile that never reached his calculating eyes. He was older than both of us, maybe 50, with salt and pepper hair and the confident posture of someone used to being obeyed. Alexandra, he said, surprise evident in his voice. I didn't expect to see you here. Miss Jackson is taking private poker lessons, Kimberly explained smoothly, gesturing to the table covered with practice hands. Professional development. Thomas's gaze moved between us, suspicion forming like a storm cloud. Indeed. Multitasking, I see. What can I help you with, Mr. Long? Kimberly's tone was pure business. I'm here about the Chicago Championship. He dropped into a chair without being invited. I understand you're participating. I participate every year. Yes, but this year there are concerns. He straightened his already perfect tie, about associations that might compromise the integrity of the competition. His eyes flicked meaningfully toward me. My cheeks burned. Alexandra has taken leave for personal reasons, Kimberly said. Any associations are professional and above board. Of course. His smile was thin. Still, the optics of a dealer training with a player are irrelevant unless someone is looking for problems. Kimberly's voice could have frozen Lake Michigan. Is that what you're doing, Thomas? Looking for problems? He laughed, a hollow sound. Just doing my due diligence. The casino has substantial interest in the tournament's reputation. Your concern is noted. Kimberly moved toward the door, a clear dismissal. If that's all? Thomas stood but made no move to leave. Instead, he wandered to the window, looking out over the city. Beautiful view. You can almost see the observatory from here. The Chicago Stargazers Society, isn't it? Fascinating hobby for a poker player. My blood ran cold, he knew. Somehow he knew about us meeting there. Astronomy helps me maintain perspective, Kimberly replied smoothly. The universe makes human concerns seem appropriately small. Indeed. Thomas finally headed for the door. Good luck with your training, ladies. When the elevator doors closed behind him, Kimberly's composed facade cracked. He's having us watched. Why? I asked, still shaken. Because knowledge is power. She began pacing. He suspects something between us, which he can use as leverage. What do we do? Kimberly stopped pacing, her expression softening as she looked at me. For the first time in days I saw the woman who'd kissed me under Lambert's comet, not the poker champion. We need to be more careful, she said, taking my hand. And I need to remember what we're fighting for isn't just the money. Her fingers interlaced with mine, and something unspoken passed between us. An acknowledgement that whatever this was, it had become more complicated than either of us had anticipated. I'm sorry, she whispered, pulling me closer. I've been too hard on you. When she kissed me, it was like coming up for air after drowning in strategy and statistics. I melted against her, all the tension of our training dissolving with her touch. "Can we take a real break?" I murmured against her lips. "Just an hour?" Her smile was the first genuine one I'd seen in days. "I suppose that can be arranged." As she led me toward the bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's visit had changed everything, and that our carefully constructed plans were now visible to precisely the wrong person. The week after Thomas's unexpected visit, we became painfully aware of eyes watching our every move. Twice I spotted a woman with cropped dark hair following me from the grocery store to my apartment. Once, the same woman sat 3 tables away at the coffee shop where Kimberly and I met to discuss tournament strategy. "Don't look now, but she's back," I muttered over my latte, keeping my expression neutral. 2 o'clock, blue jacket. Kimberly didn't turn. Amelia Brown, former military intelligence, now Thomas's personal security specialist. "How do you know her name?" "I make it my business to know everyone in Chicago's poker circle." She took a careful sip of her espresso. "Thomas hired her 3 months ago, supposedly for casino security. And, unofficially, she investigates players he suspects of cheating, gathers leverage." Kimberly's mouth curved into a humorless smile. "She's actually quite good. Made us at the astronomy club last week." My stomach dropped. "What?" "Don't panic." Her hand briefly covered mine before withdrawing. "Just assume we're being watched whenever we're in public." That night, I suggested we meet at the Chicago Stargazer Society's special Aurora Borealis viewing. Weather reports predicted a rare display visible as far south as Illinois, something that hadn't happened in over a decade. "It'll be crowded," I explained over the phone, careful with my words. "Safer to talk there." When we arrived separately at the observatory, the place was packed with amateur astronomers and curious citizens alike, perfect for disappearing into a crowd. In the dim blue light of the observation deck, with dozens of people milling around telescopes and viewing stations, it was easy to blend in. Kimberly found me near the north-facing telescopes. She wore a simple navy coat, her blonde hair hidden beneath a knitted cap. Without her usual polished appearance, she looked younger, more approachable. "Look up," she whispered, standing close beside me. Above us, green and purple lights danced across the night sky, like ghostly curtains, shimmering and pulsing with otherworldly energy. The crowd collectively gasped as a particularly bright ribbon of light unfurled across the stars. "It's incredible," I breathed, momentarily forgetting our troubles. "Nature's greatest light show." Kimberly's arm pressed against mine as she tilted her head skyward. "When I was a child, my father drove us 8 hours north just to see this. He said it was how the universe reminded us of magic." In that moment, with the aurora painting her features in ethereal light, she looked nothing like the Sphinx, just a woman sharing a cherished memory. "Do you see her?" I asked quietly, scanning the crowd for our stalker. "Northeast corner, trying too hard to look interested in astronomy." Kimberly didn't turn her head. She took photos of us entering separately. "Probably has a directional microphone too. Let's give her something to hear then." I led Kimberly toward a more secluded section of the observation deck, where the telescopes were positioned for deep space viewing rather than the aurora. "What are you doing?" she whispered, following my lead. "Creating a diversion." I stopped at an unmanned telescope. When I was in graduate school, I studied stellar objects that emitted irregular pattern signatures, stars that shouldn't exist according to conventional models. Kimberly raised an eyebrow. "This is your idea of a diversion?" "Just follow along." I adjusted the telescope slightly. My theory was that these anomalies weren't errors in our detection methods, but evidence of a different kind of celestial object altogether. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She was catching on. "And how does this relate to our current project?" "Patterns that appear random often aren't," I continued, louder than necessary. "They simply operate according to rules we haven't yet identified." For the next 20 minutes, we discussed astronomical theories while actually communicating through subtle hand gestures and notes typed into our phones. By the time we'd finished, we had established a new meeting location and communication protocol that Amelia wouldn't easily track. As the aurora began to fade, the crowd gradually dispersed. Kimberly and I remained, pretending to be engrossed in the telescope. "I miss this," she said unexpectedly, her voice barely audible. "The simplicity of looking up and feeling small. Before poker, before everything got so complicated. What did you want to be, before the cards? An astrophysicist. Her admission surprised me. Like my father. I was on that path until my mother gambled away my college fund after his death. So you turned to poker to understand why it consumed her, to master what destroyed her. She adjusted the telescope needlessly. Ironic that I became what I hated. You're nothing like her, I insisted. You calculate odds, you don't chase luck. Don't I? Her eyes met mine, vulnerable in a way I'd rarely seen. What do you call this tournament? This partnership with you? It's the biggest gamble I've ever taken. I wanted to kiss her then, surveillance be damned, but instead replied, some risks are worth taking. As we prepared to leave separately, Kimberly caught my arm. There's something else you should know about the tournament. What? It's not just about the money for me. Her expression was dead serious. I have evidence that several major tournaments, including the Chicago Championship, have been compromised. Predetermined outcomes, programming design flaws in electronic shufflers. You're going to expose it? With your help. She squeezed my arm. Your pattern recognition skills are the key. I need you to watch for specific betting sequences during the preliminary rounds. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because knowledge is dangerous, and because, she hesitated, I needed to be sure I could trust you completely. And now? The aurora flickered one last time overhead, illuminating her face in ghostly green. Now I'm sure. As I watched her walk away, disappearing into the night with Amelia Brown discreetly following 20 paces behind, I realized Kimberly's revelation had changed everything. This wasn't just about recouping my losses anymore. We were stepping into something much bigger and potentially much more dangerous. The Chicago Championship transformed the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton into a battlefield of green felt and calculated risks. Cameras positioned strategically around the room broadcasted every hand to screens throughout the hotel. The air buzzed with tension and expensive cologne. Remember everything we practiced, Kimberly murmured as we approached the registration desk. She wore her tournament attire. A tailored black suit, hair pulled back severely, emerald earrings her only concession to femininity. The Sphinx was fully assembled, her face an unreadable mask. I'd never seen her in her professional element before, surrounded by opponents who regarded her with a mixture of respect and wariness. Several players nodded in her direction, others deliberately looked away. The power she commanded in this space was palpable. Ms. Allen, the tournament director greeted her. Always a pleasure, and this is Alexandra Jackson, my guest. Kimberly placed a possessive hand on my lower back. My lucky charm. The simple touch and casual claim sent warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the overheated ballroom. Throughout the preliminary rounds, I watched from the spectator area as Kimberly methodically eliminated opponent after opponent. Her playing style was nothing like our practice sessions. She was bolder, almost reckless at times, yet always in control. I carefully noted the betting patterns she told me to watch for, recording sequences that seemed suspiciously coordinated between certain players. During a break, she found me by the refreshment table. Notice anything? She asked quietly, pretending to select hors d'oeuvres. Table 8, I replied. The bald man with the bow tie and the woman with the jade bracelet. Their raises follow a mathematical sequence when they're in hands together. Good. She nodded slightly. That's Chen Wu and Madeline Porter. They've been working together for years. Isn't that cheating? Not technically. They're careful to make it look like strategy rather than collusion. She selected a strawberry, her fingers brushing mine as she reached across me. Keep watching. As the tournament progressed to the quarterfinals, Kimberly advanced easily. I began to believe we might actually pull this off, win the tournament, expose the corruption, and walk away with enough money to rebuild my life. But our careful plans collapsed on the third day when Thomas Long cornered me in the hotel corridor. Ms. Jackson. He smiled thinly. A word? He guided me to a private conference room where Amelia Brown waited, a manila folder on the table before her. You've been difficult to reach, Thomas said, closing the door. Not answering calls from the casino about your extended leave. I've been busy. I kept my voice steady despite my racing heart. Indeed. He gestured to Amelia, who opened the folder and spread several glossy photographs across the table. My stomach dropped. There we were, Kimberly and I kissing outside the astronomy club, holding hands in her building's elevator, embracing by her penthouse window. Your relationship with Miss Allen poses certain ethical concerns. Thomas's voice was silky with threat. A dealer romantically involved with a player who frequents her tables. I'm on leave, I countered. And my personal life is... Your personal life becomes professional concern when it potentially compromises casino integrity. He tapped one of the photos. The Gaming Commission would be very interested in these. What do you want? I asked, already knowing the answer. Information. He sat across from me. Specifically on how Kimberly plans to play her semifinal hand against Victor Masterson tomorrow. Victor, one of the players Kimberly had explicitly warned me about. Thomas's chosen champion. I don't know her strategy. Don't insult my intelligence. Thomas leaned forward. You've been training with her for weeks. She trusts you. And now you're going to help me ensure the right outcome tomorrow. Or what? You'll release the photos? I forced a laugh. This isn't the 1950s. No one cares about two consenting adults. Perhaps not, he conceded. But the Gaming Commission cares deeply about casino employees who may be feeding information to professional players. At minimum, you'd lose your license. More likely, you'd face charges. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Help him cheat, or lose everything again. What exactly do you want from me? He smiled, victory in his eyes. Simple. Feed her misinformation about Victor's tells. Make her think he blinks twice before bluffing, when actually it's when he has a monster hand. That's it? That's it. One small deception to protect your career. He closed the folder of photos. Consider it carefully, Alexandra. You have until midnight to decide. When I left the conference room, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely text Kimberly, need to talk, emergency. She responded immediately. Room 1217. Come now. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, paranoid about being followed. When she opened her hotel room door, one look at my face told her everything. Thomas approached you. Not a question. He has photos. Of us. I sank onto the bed. He wants me to feed you false information about Victor's tells. Kimberly's expression darkened. So he is involved. This confirms everything. What do we do? She sat beside me, taking my hands in hers. We stick to the plan. You tell him you'll do it. And actually do it? Sabotage you? Of course not. She squeezed my hands. But he needs to believe you're cooperating. I shook my head. I can't go back to the casino after this. Even if we win, even if we expose everything, my career there is over. Then we'll find you something better. Her certainty was almost convincing. Trust me, Alexandra. But as I looked into her determined eyes, I realized I wasn't sure if I did trust her, not completely. The Sphinx had built a career on deception, on making people see what she wanted them to see. What if I was just another mark in her elaborate game? I should go, I said, pulling away. If they're watching your room... She didn't try to stop me. At the door I paused. Kimberly, are you using me? Her face showed genuine hurt. Is that what you think? I don't know what to think anymore. As I walked away, her soft answer followed me into the hallway. I guess we'll both find out tomorrow. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on my hotel room balcony watching Chicago's skyline blur through tears of frustration. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I texted Thomas, I'll do it, then shut off my phone. The semifinals were scheduled for 2 p.m. I arrived early, settling into the spectator area with a perfect view of the featured table where Kimberly would face Victor Masterson. The room buzzed with anticipation, the Sphinx versus Thomas Long's protégé, a matchup that had tournament followers salivating. Kimberly entered with characteristic poise, nodding to acquaintances but speaking to no one. She didn't look in my direction. Victor followed minutes later, young, handsome in a corporate way, with the confident stride of someone who'd never truly failed at anything. As the cards were dealt for the first hand, I spotted Thomas in the VIP section. He caught my eye and raised his champagne glass slightly. Message received. He believed I'd betrayed Kimberly. The match progressed with excruciating tension. Kimberly played conservatively at first, feeling out her opponent. Victor was aggressive, pushing hard on mediocre hands, clearly believing his strategy would intimidate the Sphinx. Amateur mistake. By the third hour, Kimberly had claimed a modest chip lead. The real turning point came when Victor went all in on what appeared to be a bluff. Kimberly called instantly. When the cards flipped, gasps rippled through the audience. Victor's bluff was actually a full house. Kimberly's straight flush destroyed it. Thomas's face darkened. He'd expected Kimberly to fold based on the misinformation I was supposed to have fed her. Instead, she'd read Victor perfectly. During the break, I slipped away to the ladies' room, needing space to breathe. When I emerged from the stall, Kimberly stood at the sink, calmly washing her hands. "You didn't use the false tell," I whispered, checking under stalls for eavesdroppers. "I never intended to." She dried her hands methodically. "I needed to see what you would do. You were testing me?" Her eyes met mine in the mirror. "I was giving you room to make your own choice. And if I'd actually betrayed you, then I'd have known exactly what our relationship meant to you." Her voice was steady, but tinged with vulnerability I'd rarely heard. Before I could respond, the door swung open. Another player entered, eyeing us curiously. Kimberly left without another word, her subtle nod telling me everything she couldn't say aloud. When play resumed, Kimberly's strategy shifted dramatically. She began playing looser, taking risks that made me nervous. Victor seemed to gain confidence, slowly rebuilding his stack, maybe too slowly. As I watched his betting patterns, something clicked in my mind. I began scribbling notes frantically. Betting sequences, timing tells, the mathematical progression of raises. It wasn't just Victor, it was the entire tournament structure. The electronic shuffler on the featured table was programmed with subtle irregularities, creating predictable card distribution patterns every 17 hands. Someone had rigged the most prestigious poker tournament in the Midwest. I needed to get this information to Kimberly immediately, but security was tight around the players. As I debated my options, Victor went all in on what should have been a losing hand according to standard probabilities. Kimberly hesitated, studying him with the intensity that had earned her nickname. Then, inexplicably, she folded. The audience murmured in confusion. The Sphinx never backed down from calculated risks. Victor collected a massive pot, grinning as he stacked his chips. Kimberly's expression remained impassive, but I could read the minute tensions around her eyes. She was following a different strategy than we'd discussed. 3 hands later, it happened again. Victor made a statistically improbable play that succeeded because Kimberly abandoned her normal approach. The pattern was now unmistakable. She was deliberately losing. By the final hand, Victor had a 3-1 chip advantage. The atmosphere was electric as he pushed all in on the river. The cameras zoomed in on Kimberly's face as she considered her options, the entire room holding its breath. She folded. Victor Masterson had defeated the Sphinx to advance to the finals. The crowd erupted in surprised cheers while Thomas Long smiled smugly from his very important person perch. I rushed toward the exit, desperate to intercept Kimberly before she disappeared. As I rounded a corner, someone grabbed my arm, pulling me into a service corridor. "Did you see it?" Kimberly's eyes blazed with intensity I'd never witnessed before. "The shuffler pattern?" "Yes. Every 17 hands." "Exactly." She squeezed my arm. "I needed to lose that match, Alexandra. Needed Victor to advance with absolute confidence that the system works." "But why?" "Because the final match is where we expose everything." She pulled a small USB drive from her pocket. "This contains the algorithm prediction for tomorrow's final. If the cards fall exactly as predicted here, we have irrefutable proof the tournament is rigged." "But you've lost your chance at the prize money," I said, realization dawning. "We've lost our chance. Money can be replaced." Her expression softened. "Trust can't." I knew then she was talking about more than just the tournament. "I didn't betray you," I whispered. "I know." She brushed her fingers against my cheek. "Now we finish this together." As we formulated our plan in hushed tones, I realized Kimberly had been playing a much longer game than I'd understood. One where the true prize wasn't money but justice for a corrupt system that had claimed too many victims. 6 months passed like a slow-played hand finally revealed. I stood on the observation deck of our Lakeshore Drive apartment, watching Lambert's comet make its return journey across Chicago's night sky. The telescope, a ridiculously expensive birthday gift from Kimberly, captured the celestial visitor in crisp detail. "Any different from last time?" Kimberly asked, joining me on the balcony. She wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her chin on my shoulder. Brighter, I replied, leaning back into her embrace. More defined tail. Like us, she murmured against my neck. Clearer trajectory now. So much had changed since that final tournament day. I smiled, remembering the look on Thomas Long's face when we'd presented our evidence to the Gaming Commission. Irrefutable proof that the Chicago Championship had been systematically rigged for years. The electronic shufflers programmed with subtle biases. The coordinated betting patterns among select players. The mathematical impossibility of certain hands appearing with their recorded frequency. The scandal rocked the poker world. Thomas and several tournament officials faced criminal charges. Victor Masterson turned state's evidence, revealing how he'd been groomed as the tournament's golden boy. The Royal Flush Casino underwent complete management restructuring. I never returned to dealing. Instead, Kimberly and I established the Fair Play Foundation, using a portion of the settlement money to advocate for transparency in gambling regulations. The foundation provided particular support for families affected by gambling addiction, Kimberly's way of honoring her mother's memory while preventing others from falling into the same trap. "Penny for your thoughts?" Kimberly asked, turning me to face her. Just thinking about how differently things could have gone. I traced the constellation pattern on her silver ring, the one I'd first noticed the night we met. If you hadn't lost that semi-final match deliberately. If you'd actually fed me false information about Victor's tells, she countered with a slight smile. If Lambert's comet hadn't appeared exactly when it did. She laughed softly. Are you suggesting astronomical forces brought us together? I'm suggesting pattern recognition isn't limited to cards. I wrapped my arms around her neck. Some things are written in the stars. That's uncharacteristically romantic coming from a mathematician, she teased. You've corrupted me, I admitted. I've started believing in things beyond statistical probability. The night air carried the first hint of spring warmth, a welcome change from Chicago's brutal winter. Below us, the city stretched out in a grid of light and shadow, organized chaos, much like the path that had brought us to this moment. I have something for you, Kimberly said, reaching into her pocket. A commemorative token. She placed a poker chip in my palm, not a standard casino chip, but one specially made with 2 constellations etched on opposite sides. Ursa Major, I identified, running my finger over the familiar pattern. Turn it over. I flipped it. Cassiopeia. The bear and the queen, she explained. Always opposite each other in the night sky, forever circling the same celestial pole. Never touching but never apart, I added, understanding the metaphor. Until now. She took the chip from my hand and placed it on the telescope stand. I've spent my life keeping people at calculated distances. The Sphinx persona wasn't just for poker, it was for everything. Everyone. I waited, sensing something important forming behind her careful words. But you saw through it from the beginning, she continued. That night at your blackjack table, you were reading me while I thought I was reading you. Professional hazard. I smiled. Dealers spend their lives watching people pretend. She took both my hands in hers, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. I'm not pretending anymore, Alexandra. I haven't been since you stormed into that employee corridor and called me out for counting cards. The memory made me laugh. I was terrified, also a little turned on. That's been our pattern, hasn't it? Fear and attraction, calculation and impulse. She stepped closer. I'm ready to start a new pattern with you. My breath caught as she pressed her lips to mine. Unlike our first desperate kisses or our passionate reconciliations, this kiss held something different: certainty, promise, home. When we separated, she whispered against my lips, "Look through the telescope one more time." Curious, I bent to the eyepiece. Lambert's comet filled the frame, its brilliant tail streaming across the darkness. But something was different. A small, dark object seemed to travel alongside it. What am I seeing? Astronomers call it a companion object, Kimberly explained, her voice soft with meaning. Once thought to be alone in its journey, Lambert's comet actually has a partner traveling the same path through space and time. I straightened to look at her, understanding dawning. Like us, she agreed. Not a coincidence. Not a temporary alignment. A permanent orbit. Later that night, as moonlight painted shadows across our bedroom. Kimberly traced patterns on my skin, like constellations waiting to be discovered. Her touch mapped territories now familiar but never fully explored, each caress a declaration without words. I responded in kind, my hands following the curves I'd memorized, drawing gasps that matched the rhythm of our shared breath. We moved together with the synchronicity of celestial bodies, predictable yet miraculous in their precision. No longer the Sphinx and the dealer, no longer player and observer, just two women who had found in each other the pattern they'd been seeking all along. "I love you," she whispered against my neck, words she'd never said before, though I'd felt them in 100 different ways. "I know," I replied, smiling against her hair. "Your tell gave you away months ago."